Okay, here we go. Jaloul Ayed, thank you very much for giving some time for
My
us.
pleasure.
You just had a very interesting discussion with some of your colleagues about intra-African deals and deal flow. And I was interested, you mentioned particularly the growth of private equity playing a very big role in Africa. Just how important has that been for some of the developments you've seen?
Extremely important because if you were to analyze the economic fabric of most of the African countries, all of them in fact, I mean, you will realize that more than 90% of the enterprises forming the economy are small and medium-sized enterprises. And the problem of financing those enterprises is a real issue, and you'll find this issue in all over the countries. And very often they say that lack of access to bank credit is the problem. What I say is that that is certainly a problem, but there is a bigger problem, which explains why there is lack of access to bank credit, and that's the lack of equity. And therefore, given the chance to particularly the medium-sized enterprises to have access to equity in the local markets, but actually through investment funds, is extremely important because when you give access to the SMEs to equity funding, then that will enforce or reinforce their capital base, and then they can go to their banks with a good business plan, having that strong capital base, and then be able to negotiate credit terms with their bankers. And therefore, the importance of private equity is important because we're talking about those entities or those enterprises that don't have access to stock exchange. They have to have access to private capital and private equity through investment funds of different types. Okay, will give them that possibility.
Now, Colin Coleman in that panel mentioned that part of the dynamic of private equity is that they obviously invest, but then they have to find and engineer the exits. I mean, as we're seeing some of those investments mature and some exits occurring, are you seeing sort of increasing activity and sophistication in the capital markets? So those companies sort of have graduated into a different situation?
It depends on the markets. I mean, where in markets where the stock exchange is quite deep and liquid, the most favorable exit strategy would be listing on the stock exchange.
Sure.
Okay, but more often than not, that's not possible or that's difficult. Okay?
There are probably 4 or 5 exchanges in Africa.
Exactly, and therefore there are some other strategies, and that should be structured at the time of the investment. Usually the exit strategy, therefore, would be either what we call a trade sale, meaning selling the participation to a third party, or setting forth an agreement with the owner of the company upfront, agreeing with those owners that if a listing in the stock exchange is not possible, then they will repurchase the stake of the private equity investor at certain conditions to be determined upfront. And so more and more we'll see that there will be such arrangements being considered at the time of the investment. But obviously what we hope for Africa is that our stock exchanges will develop in the future and will be more liquid and more profound, which obviously will avoid any problems at the time of exit, because obviously anybody who would invest in a company, particularly in a medium-sized company, would want to make sure that within a certain number of years, maybe 7 years, 10 years, they would want to exit at higher multiples. And
Sure.
so if the stock exchange does not give them that possibility, they're going to have to look at some other alternatives.
Trade sales.
Trade sales, I
Yeah.
think, is probably the most common today. And but private equity is important.
Sure.
It is. I mean, as we move up the curve in terms of the development of our financial systems, we have to find ways to accompany the medium-sized enterprises by providing them the possibility to raise capital. And that's why I believe that in the policies that are set forth by the different African governments, they really have to think very seriously as to how to develop those markets. And one of the ways they can do that is by creating national funds, okay, that will put the seed money, meaning given the trust and faith that the government would have in those funds, okay, to raise capital and therefore to finance the ultimate users of the capital. Okay, so it is one of the most challenging policy matters that most African countries are facing today, but it's one that needs to be tackled very seriously.
Right. Now you're an official candidate for the presidency of the African Development Bank. What role can those multilateral institutions play in Africa? Do they still have a very important role, or as Africa becomes more sophisticated, does the importance of that diminish?
Oh, I think they'll continue to play an extremely important role. Think of the reform of the financial systems. You know, before this interview, I was talking to one of the Gabonese ministers who was asking me about how to develop the capital markets. I mean, in other words, how to raise long-term capital to finance medium to long-term projects. I think that the African Development Bank can play an extremely important role in helping the countries and the regions developing capital markets that will allow large project sponsors to raise the funding they need for infrastructure projects, for example, or for any projects that would require a lot of money but over the long term. And as you know, of course, the alternative is to go to the international capital markets, and we know how difficult that can be, right? Not just difficult to access those markets, but how difficult to hedge, for example, the foreign exchange risk. So developing capital markets is extremely important as Africa is looking forward to invest more and more on infrastructure, on building all types of infrastructure, and on being able to mobilize the funding necessary for that.
All right. Great. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.